Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Okay, chapter 5, we're in video 7 today, and there is going to be one more video. So this chapter, the end of chapter 5, seems to be taking a long time to get through. There's just a lot of stuff I want to say about it. So there's one more coming after this. This video is broken up into two parts: physical and biological systems, and then psychic systems. And basically, Deleuze, we just break these down, these different kinds of systems, by those three, what I called domains in the last video of Deleuze's philosophy: the ideas, individuation, and differentiation or actualization. So the first part of the video, physical and biological systems. So physical and biological systems are distinguished, Deleuze says, by three things, and it's those three main areas in his philosophy. So the first is the order of ideas that they incarnate or actualize. We've talked about that before, the different kinds of ideas, how they determine different kinds of systems, the actualization of different kinds of systems. The second way they're distinguished is through the process of individuation, which determines the eventual actualization. So the process of individuation distinguishes physical and biological systems. In physical systems, they are individuated all at once, Deleuze says, and the individuation affects only the boundaries. He doesn't go into any depth on this, but when I think about this, what I'm imagining is something like a crystal, where individuation takes place. In the first place, individuation affects only the boundaries, so the crystal grows through changes at the limits of what it is, and it's any kind of actualization, any kind of further development only happens at the borders of it. And so that's what I think he means when he says it affects only the boundaries. There's no individuation taking place in the core of the thing in a physical system, and it happens all at once. And again, very similarly, the individuations that take place, that cause the crystal to grow, there's no kind of reciprocity. There's no engagement of the crystal with the external environment. It's just that the individuation happens and it finishes. And if there's to be another individuation, that's going to build on top of that, extend away from it. So the each individuation happens kind of discretely, discontinuously, and can be considered a separate individuation from those that came before it. Biological systems, on the other hand, individuate in successive waves of singularities, which involve the whole internal milieu. So a very different kind of individuation, which, as opposed to that of a physical system, the individuation takes place, and any individuation that happens affects the entire organism, because we're talking about an organism now, where all of the parts, if you like, are connected in a greater whole. So that the whole internal milieu is affected, and there are successive waves of singularities. So it's not just a single individuation happens and then another individuation and another individuation. An individuation involves a lot of reciprocity. There's an engagement with the environment, and that is how I think Deleuze sees the difference here between individuation in physical systems and biological systems. Like I say, he doesn't go into any depth at all on this. Gilbert Simondon, however, I mentioned him in the last video, he does go into a lot of detail. So if you want to really drill in onto individuation, I strongly recommend his book, Individuation in Light of Notions of Form and Information. That supremely unwieldy title. And the third way that physical and biological systems are distinguished is through the figures of differentiation with a C, which represent actualization itself. So in physical systems, differentiation takes place through simple physical qualification and distribution. And that's referring to the qualities and the extension that we've talked a lot about in this chapter. Biological systems, however, when they explicate with a greater degree of organization and involve the determination of species. So you get this more complex, more organized kind of actualization with a biological system that naturally groups itself by species, that differentiates itself into these different groupings, which we call species. And there's a note on this regarding entropy with this as well. So in both cases, and we talked about this in the last video, but just a quick recap, in both cases, physical and biological systems, explication is the cancellation of productive difference. We talked about that as the, I think I called it the metaphysical aspect to entropy. So explication cancels productive difference. And it's also the erasure of differentiation with a C. So it cancels the novelty that comes about through differentiation, and it does that in physical systems through the attaining of physical equilibrium, where no more change is possible. It's reached like the lowest energy state, if you like. There's no more difference to promote any further kind of change or growth. And in biological systems, this is obviously death, where the same thing applies. So those three ways that Deleuze distinguishes between physical and biological systems, mapping onto the three domains of his philosophy here. Okay, let's have a look at psychic systems. So again, we're going to discuss psychic systems in terms of this threefold structure: ideas, implication-individuation, and explication-differenciation with a C. And we're going to go backwards for some reason. I'm not sure exactly why Deleuze does this in the book, but I originally switched it around actually and started with ideas, but then it didn't quite work out as smoothly. So I think this is the right way to go, the right approach to take. Start with differentiation, go to individuation, and then finish with ideas. So explication-differenciation first. Deleuze says that psychic systems are actualized in two aspects: the I and the self. And I think there are three comments I want to make about these two, and because they are they're correlative, I'm going to combine them and discuss both the I and the self together. So the I, Deleuze says, is the psychic determination of species, and that's opposed to the self, which is the psychic organization, the properly psychic organism. So the difference there between the I and the self is the I is the species, determination of species. So it's that more general, I could say universal aspect of actualization, whereas the self is properly psychic organism. So it's the particular that is being, it's the particular entity that is being actualized. Which is important to note, because the I then is not what we normally think of it. In particular, the I is this. It doesn't apply to the specific individuals right here. It doesn't apply to the, no, it's not. It doesn't apply to the concrete being that's being actualized in the way that we normally think of ourselves. I think of myself as an I, but that's not the way Deleuze uses the word here. I refers to the species that I belong to. The self is is me, the organism that I am. That's the particular. So along those same lines then, the I is the universal form of psychic life, and the self is the universal matter of that form. So those two kind of correlate nicely as form and matter. And interestingly, he says the I is a form of identity, in that it's the same for different members of a species. And matter, regarding the self, matter is organized in a continuity of resemblance, in the sense that the particular member of the species, which belongs to that species, to that group through identity, each as it grows, as it develops, each development resembles the prior developments or prior states. So there's an element of continuity throughout the particular being's existence, and this is governed, if you like, by the rule of resemblance. So a couple of things to say about that, those two aspects. First, the I and the self don't arise in individuation. So they arise after individuation, in this, where we are now, the explication-differenciation phase. And this is the only reason I point that out, is because we usually think of individuation as individuating us into who we are, a specific I or self. Whereas for Deleuze, the I and the self only arise after individuation. Individuation is not where the I or the self that you are arises. We'll look at how what happens within individuation in the next in a moment. Another thing that's important here is the way that the I is understood as being identical, is kind of governed by this rule of identity, and the self governed by the rule of resemblance. So this tells us that now we're on the side of representation here, not on the side of difference anymore. We're on the side of we've moved out of Deleuze's main interest, which is concerned with difference in that metaphysical or transcendental sense, and now we're on the other side of representation, where the I has become something concrete. The self has become something concrete. So it's not governed by differential relations anymore. It doesn't come under that rubric. Now we've moved to the other side, which is the domain of representation. So the I is identity, the self is resemblance. And in this sense then, I've written this. Let me think about this. Yeah, that's right. This means that the I and the self, for Deleuze anyway, in the way that Deleuze in his metaphysics, they don't really exist. They belong to the representation side. They're a derivative notion. They're not originary, because the originary domain is the metaphysical one, and there is no I, there is no self. So they're like derived secondary notions. They're in the domain of representation now. Identity, resemblance, these are the things that govern the I and the self. And this, for me, is where phenomenology kicks in. Phenomenology has nothing to do with the metaphysical side. It doesn't try to account for how an individual arises, how an individual comes to be in reality. But it takes that I that's there and investigates what it is to be that I, what it is to be a concrete human existent in the world. And that's, as I say, that's where phenomenology comes in. Deleuze doesn't have too much more to say about this because it's moving away from his area of interest, which is that those three divisions, ideas, individuation, differentiation. Once he's got those, and all of the book is about differentiation, right, and repetition, difference and repetition, and these are concepts that apply in setting up how any individual, how any concrete being is actualized. Once you get that actualization, then we can move off into phenomenology, but that's beyond what Deleuze wants to discuss here. Okay, and then we have the second domain, which is implication-individuation. So let me start this section with a quote, and that this will guide our investigation of this domain. Individuation is mobile, strangely supple, fortuitous, and endowed with fringes and margins, all because the intensities which contribute to it communicate with each other, envelop other intensities, and are in turn enveloped. The individual is far from indivisible, never ceasing to divide and change its nature. It is not a self with regard to what it expresses, for it expresses ideas in the form of internal multiplicities made up of differential relations and distinctive points or pre-individual singularities. Nor is it an I with regard to its expressive character, for here again it forms a multiplicity of actualization, as though it were a condensation of distinctive points or an open collection of intensities. So first thing to note about that, it's a nice description of individuation as supple, fortuitous, involving fringes and margins. So really capturing this idea of individuation as a fluid, dynamic flux, not something that involves like a crystallization of an entity that becomes, bang, the thing that it is. There's always this back and forth, this movement within it. And the reason for it being so dynamic is that it's intensive. It's fundamentally intensity. It's composed of different intensities which communicate with each other, which are constantly enveloping other intensities and being enveloped by other intensities. So it's that the idea that this whole process of individuation is governed by intensity that gets you this constant dynamism. So therefore, the individual is always changing, is always dividing, is always in flux. And this means that the individual is neither a self in what it expresses, nor an I in its expressive character. So it's not a self because what is expressed is always more ideas. It's always more virtual multiplicities, which then undergo more, or which are then made up of more different differential relations, different degrees of variation, and these cancel, these interact again, and it's just a never-ending cycle. So what it's like the outcome, the solution to these problems just generates further problems. So there's no self there in terms of what is expressed in the process of individuation, nor is there a self in what is doing the expressing, the I. Because what expresses here, the I, what determines actualization, is always a movement of that multiplicity. So it's always that, it's that intensity which is always catalyzing the differences that exist within the idea. So there's no I and there's no self, but we can go further than that, and Deleuze does. The individual in intensity finds its psychic image neither in the organization of the self nor in the determination of species of the I, but rather in the fractured I and the dissolved self, and in the correlation of the fractured I with the dissolved self. So, good connection, good link back to explication and differentiation there. The individual in intensity doesn't result in an organization of the self or determination of species of the I. Those words, it's just interesting to me that Deleuze can keep all of these things in line, like use them consistently. Organization of the self, we talked about that with regards to explication-differenciation, right? The psychic determination of species is what the I was, and the psychic organization is what the self was, and that terminology is being used consistently. That's the amazing thing. He doesn't get these words around the wrong way. So anyway, the psychic image is of the individual in intensity is neither in the organization of the self or in the in the determination of the species, but rather in the fractured I and the dissolved self. So this is important because we need to connect this back, I think, to the third synthesis of time, where we talked about the fractured I and the divided self. So we've got this process of individuation. All that exists is the intensive field, with its ever-changing, implicated, enveloped relations and degrees of variation. So there's no I, there's no self in the sense that we saw there was in the explication. But here, we don't have an I or a self here. Instead, we've got this fractured I and the dissolved self. So there is I was trying to see how this does connect, and I think it does if you put in a little bit of legwork, but it is kind of difficult to connect this section back to the syntheses of time. But I think we can do it because the spatiotemporal dynamism happens in this process of individuation. It's as the being is being actualized. It's being actualized through space and time and consciousness, if you can remember that. And that means that here, the I that we're dealing with is fractured. And it was fractured in the third synthesis of time because we didn't have an I there anymore. The time fractured the I into that before and after. It gave it kind of a history. History arose, history comes more with the divided self, but divided into a past and divided into a before and an after, so that now the I doesn't exist as a complete whole. It's broken into these. Its life is broken into before and after. Time now has meaning, has relevance for it. And here, the sense is a little bit different. The I's fractured because, again, there's no totality which we can call a fixed, constant, harmonious I. But it's fractured because it's broken up into these different intensive multiplicities, which are constantly relating to other multiplicities here. So there's this like dynamic field where we can't bring any. We can't impose any totality on the whole. It's just the whole thing's just divided. So it's fractured in that sense, and it's somewhat different from the way that we talked about the I being fractured in the third synthesis of time. But I think if you bring in the first two syntheses, habit and memory, then because these are going on at the same time, the same time. But what those syntheses are what are taking place in this field of individuation. So it's like the first and the second syntheses kind of accumulate and create this fracture in the I. And the first and the second syntheses are happening in the field of individuation throughout this virtual multiplicity. And so that's how I kind of connect the fractured I here back to third synthesis of time. The dissolved self is a little bit trickier because it's quite different to say the self is dissolved and the self is divided, right? The divided self was where we got the self was divided into those three parts, roughly corresponding to the past, present, and the future, but not in a temporal linear sense. And here, that the divided self, I think, seems to correlate more to the self in explication that we talked about just before. This dissolved self, the sense seems to me to be quite different. The self is dissolved because there's no locus anymore at this stage in the process of individuation. What's happening, like I said, it's all we have is this intensive field of individuation. So the self, if we can even talk of that, is literally dispersed, dissolved amongst the different elements that make up this field. And I think that's what he means when he says dissolved self, and I think that is quite different from the divided self that we talked about in the third synthesis. It is quite tough to connect those two, but that's kind of those are my thoughts on it anyway. So we've got the fractured I and the dissolved self within the process of individuation, in the individual that is being individuated. However, this isn't a problem. We might think of this as something that we want to overcome, a problem that we need to fix. The I is fractured, the self is dissolved, this can't be right. But Deleuze says there's nothing wrong with this. The error, however, is to believe that this indetermination or this relativity indicates something incomplete in individuality or something interrupted in individuation. On the contrary, they express the full positive power of the individual as such, and the manner in which it is distinguished in nature from both an I and a self. The individual is distinguished from the I and the self just as the intense order of implications is distinguished from the extensive and qualitative order of explication. So the fact that individuation is in flux like this, it's never complete, it's never condenses into any organized form. It's always, the I is always fractured, the self is always dissolved. This is not a problem. There's nothing incomplete. There's nothing, the process of individuation hasn't been interrupted or broken. It's just what it is for an individual to be an individual. There's nothing wrong, there's nothing missing, there's nothing lacking in this picture. And so along the same lines, he says this isn't, or he doesn't say it, but he says it's positive. So again, this contrast between, this distinction between negativity and positivity, the negative and the positive, it's not negative. The fact that there's no crystallized I or self here is not, it's not a bad thing. It's not something that must be overcome. It's purely positive in itself as such. It's positive in its indetermination, in its relativity, in its nature as fractured and dissolved. That is pure positivity. It's not a negation which will be rectified or will be solved or put right through some future act. That indetermination, that fracturing, the dissolution, that is exactly the way it should be, exactly the way it has to be. And Deleuze goes on to emphasize this whole section, talking about individuation like this, in relation to Nietzsche, actually. No doubt the I and the self must be replaced by an undifferentiated abyss, but this abyss is neither an impersonal nor an abstract universal beyond individuation. On the contrary, it is the I and the self which are the abstract universals. They must be replaced, but in and by individuation, in the direction of the individuating factors which consume them and which constitute the fluid world of Dionysus. What cannot be replaced is individuation itself. Beyond the self and the I, we find not the impersonal, but the individual and its factors, individuation and its fields, individuality and its pre-individual singularities. For the pre-individual is still singular, just as the anti-self and the anti-I are still individual. So instead of the I and the self, there is this undifferentiated abyss. And that's a nice Nietzschean link. And that is an interpretation that I agree with, actually. That sticks much more closely to the original meaning, I think, of Nietzsche's. So I'm all on board with that. And this abyss then, this undifferentiated with a C, so it's all it means is the field of individuation hasn't been actualized, so there's nothing concrete yet. This is the abyss that he's talking about here is the anti-I and the anti-self, or what we've also called the fractured I and the dissolved self. But that's a nice picture, I think, of how Nietzsche imagined his abyss when he talked about this. Individuating factors, full of individuating factors, intensity, enveloping, enveloped, implicating, implicated. This is it's all like Dionysus, right? This is Dionysian. This is the perfect example of what Nietzsche was talking about. It's the perfect extension of Nietzsche's idea, I think. So even though the I is only fractured and the self is dissolved in the individual, this isn't an impersonal or an abstract universal. And this is interesting, actually, because the anti-self and the anti-I are still individuated. It's just that individual doesn't mean, as we usually think, organized or harmonious or stable, fixed. We just have to think of the word individual in the way that Deleuze is using it here instead of the way we normally do. So we don't have, and this is kind of important, I think, with regards to individuation, we don't have an impersonal or abstract universal in this case. The I, the fractured I, and the self, the dissolved self, are still individual, but they're just not individual in the way we normally think of them. They're still those, what does he say, those pre-individual singularities are still singular. The pre-individual is still singular. The anti-self and the anti-I are still individual. So it's not impersonal, it's not abstract. On the contrary, he says, the I and the self are the abstract universals because they don't correspond to anything in individuation. The I and the self emerge on the side of representation once explication happens, once they've been actualized. But here, in this phase of individuation, the I and the self like that are abstract. They're universals that don't have any relevance within this domain. When we think beyond the I and the self in individuation, we find, instead of the impersonal, we find the individual and the pre-individual. So that's probably an important point, I think. And the final domain for us in psychic systems is the domain of ideas. And this is we can deal with this much more quickly because we've talked about ideas in so much depth already. I've just got a quote and a short thing to say about it, and then we'll wrap up. It is ideas which lead us from the fractured I to the dissolved self. As we have seen, what swarms around the edges of the fracture are ideas in the form of problems. In other words, in the form of multiplicities made up of differential relations and variations of relations, distinctive points and transformations of points. These ideas, however, are expressed in individuating factors in the implicated world of intensive quantities which constitute the universal concrete individuality of the thinker or the system of the dissolved self. So, really we've talked about all of that. Ideas as problems, multiplicities made up of differential relations and variations of relations, distinctive points and transformations of points. These problems are expressed in the process of individuation, which is what brings about the fractured I and the dissolved self, which is what leads into those. And so that is psychic systems, broken up into those three main areas of Deleuze's thought. So let's have a look at a summary. First up, we looked at physical and biological systems. We saw that these were distinguished by the order of ideas they incarnate or actualized, the process of individualization which determines that actualization, and the figures of differentiation which represent actualization itself. And so those three domains represented the three main areas of Deleuze's philosophy. Physical systems individualized all at once, with only the boundaries being affected. Biological systems were individualized in successive waves of singularities involving the whole internal milieu. And the differentiation, physical systems, just physical qualification and distribution or extension. Biological systems, however, were differentiated according to organization and determination of species. Then we looked at psychic systems, and again following that threefold division of Deleuze's, we looked at, and I've reversed it here, but we talked about ideas. That's the metaphysical bedrock, if you like, which is constituted by or comprised of problems, i.e. the virtual multiplicities. and these lead into the second domain, which is implication-individuation. And here we have the main idea that there's no I or self. Instead, we have a fractured I and a dissolved self. This is because it's all in flux. The process of individuation, the field of individuation is still wrapped up in intensity. There's still change, there's still variation, there's still differentiation. It's all, there's nothing is fixed or solid in this phase. And the other main idea was that even though there's no I or self, we've only got a fractured I and dissolved self, this was still not impersonal. It wasn't an abstract universal. It still had a concrete application, if you like, to the individual. It still applied directly to that individual. It wasn't an abstract idea or a universal. And we also have the last domain in Deleuze's system, explication-differenciation. And this was where we got the emergence of the I and the self. So the individual was differentiated by two aspects, the I and the self. And the I was a universal form. It was governed, we said, by identity, whereas the self was a universal matter governed there by resemblance, that continuity of the member of that species. So this is where we get the universal comes in, rather than at the stage of individuation. And this is where we moved from difference proper to representation. Hence Deleuze uses the terms identity and resemblance in this final movement. So that's those three systems, physical, biological, and psychic. And that brings us to the end of the video. In the next video, we will wrap up chapter 5. I think there's just death and the other. I think those are the two main things we're going to look at. And then it's into the conclusion. So thanks for watching. I hope this helped, and I'll catch you in the next video.